Hi, this is Maryann Fernandez from Philanthropy Indaba. I want to welcome you to our webinar to recap the insights and experiences we had during our gender lens investing trip to Kenya. As more people sign on to the webinar, I'll just take a moment here for some newcomers to just introduce Philanthropy Indaba. I started Philanthropy Indaba about 4 years ago to give opportunities for individuals, family members, corporate executives to essentially get out of the boardroom and into the field to explore issue areas, to get a sense of the ecosystem, and to really understand the context in which a lot of this amazing work is being done. Some of the real highlights are when we go to meet people on the ground in communities that are doing this amazing work, everything from amazing nonprofits that have been working in communities for a long time to some really new organizations that are employing for-profit models and bringing a new vitality and new thinking into the space. So when I met Jackie VanderBrug, who is the co-trip leader of the Gender Lens Investing trips a few years ago, she was an amazing thought leader, really growing and bringing forth this idea of gender lens investing. And so I thought it would be a great idea to, take a week and bring people into the field and see what we're really talking about. And so really thrilled that she agreed. And then we identified Kenya as a place where we can see a variety of opportunities, for-profit and nonprofit, and really get a sense of the ecosystem, but also get a sense of where we stood with regard to investing in for-profit opportunities. With that, I will unmute Jackie, and we will start our webinar.
Thanks so much, Maryann. And I do think back to that conversation that you and I had about what would it be like if we could design a trip that focused on a gender lens in investments, and think, wow, it is amazing. I am thrilled that so many of you have joined us today, and especially grateful for those in the East Coast who potentially are working from home or at least have braved a lot of shoveling this morning to join us. As Maryann and I put the Kenya trip together, we were inspired by the support that we had received. We traveled, we could feel that there was a set of those who really wanted to come along with us. We knew that schedules might have kept them, a variety of conflicts kept them, but we really did feel like this was more than a trip. It was integrated into and it was core to a movement. So we're thrilled to share both what we learned, what some of the impacts of this trip were, and where we see the role of trips like this in the future. Our agenda today, first we're going to review quickly what we mean by a gender lens, with apologies for those of you who've heard this many times from me, but it really does lead the context to the trip. Secondly, how we designed the journey, what our goals were. Third, we're going after our key learnings, both from us and from some others who were on the trip, and then finally, what's next. So with that, first, what do we mean when we say gender lens investing? The word that is essential to this is lens, because it's a lens and not a limitation. When you use a lens, you see things more clearly. You're able, when you put your glasses on, to not bump into something that's on the floor. I often say that a gender lens is part of, think of it like glasses, where with one eye you see the realities, the leadership, the assets, and the needs of women. With the other eye you see the realities, the needs, the leadership, the assets of men. And you can put those together, and with that find new opportunities for investment and ways to mitigate risk. In our purpose, that reducing risk, increasing returns, and especially increasing impact. The second thing, after you think about a lens not being a limitation but a viewfinder for opportunity, is that a lens is also personal. There isn't just one lens. That is to say, who you are, your experiences, your realities, your passions form the lens that you might use. That said, it becomes very helpful to say there are three lenses that we see most often, and many people find themselves blurring some of these. They do overlap, but it's helpful to define them out. The first is access to capital. That is to say, whether we were visiting a micro-entrepreneur in Kenya or a high-growth entrepreneur, or you're in New York and, as was recently reported, you're talking to a woman hedge fund manager, or you're out at Sundance talking to a woman who's a film director, all of these women will have less access to capital than their male counterparts. So we talk about this lens as looking at access to capital, what sometimes is called capital punishment, or women entrepreneurs, but women entrepreneurs broadly. And not surprisingly, there are many folks who will use that lens and say, I am interested in investing in women entrepreneurs and shifting that access to capital. The second is workplace equity. This is where you're looking across the value chain of an organization, from the board all the way through the supply chain, and asking the question, how is it that women's leadership and equal rights are valued? That may start with looking at the board and the composition of the board. It may look at the roles, for instance, as we looked at cooperatives in Kenya. What are the policies around women in terms of the way that their health care is taken care of? How are we thinking about culturally appropriate domestic violence, et cetera, all the way through the supply chain. And then finally, the third lens, products and services. What is it that this company produces? What are the services, and how do those services relate to problems that disproportionately affect women and girls? How is it that when those services or products are scaled, gender equality is affected in one way or the other? And again, we think very broadly here. You can think of things that are more standard, whether that's women's health care, maternal health care in low-resource situations, or car safety. All these things are related to products and services. So with that background, maybe we'll jump a little bit into the trip design, because as we were talking to folks about this trip, we realized that it was increasingly a very different trip than oftentimes had been taken. So Maryann already mentioned that we were shifting from the traditional philanthropic trip, where donors get out of the boardroom and think about where they would be using their philanthropy, to thinking about investment. And that was one shift. The second shift, though, was to think about moving from due diligence to field building. So we on this trip were not trying to say, let's find a set of companies that are ready for current investment. Instead, we wanted to understand the landscape, how it evolved, where the levers were, what was missing, what had created this particular group of investable opportunities, what would create more. It was a broader set of questions. And so this had two implications. The first is that we needed to be really clear with the groups that we were visiting about our goals, that this was not a set of investors who were making an up-down decision, but just as likely they might make connections, they would give feedback, they would increase relationships, etc. And secondly, the trip became relevant even for individuals who would never invest in Kenya. So we had individuals on the trip who were passionate about other geographies and really using this trip as a learning cauldron, as again, a way of saying, how do I understand a field that is evolving globally, this field of investing with the gender lens, and how is it that looking at Kenya might change the way that I do my investments in Colombia? The third shift was from a homogeneous group to a traveling ecosystem. Oftentimes, trips can be designed or just become a group of very similar people. So you may have men who've retired from finance who are now impact investors, and they travel together and they do due diligence, and that's a fabulous thing. You may have progressive women philanthropists on a trip, or all families who are committed to mitigating climate change. Really powerful opportunities, and not at all what this trip looked like. So that got us to who we were. It was deliberately diverse and really rock stars. So we had academics, for instance, Susan Duffy at Babson, who could give us the framework for women entrepreneurs and global trends on necessity versus opportunity as the cause of entrepreneurship, could give us statistics and understand the role of competence and support in a woman deciding to become an entrepreneur. We had philanthropists like Musimi Kanyaro from the Global Fund, who could bring the years of work that she had done on the female condom and relate that to our questions about sanitary pads. Investors like Jen Price from the Calvert Foundation, who looked at our ventures in the different stages they were in and asked questions about follow-on capital and change of control. We had NGO execs who were looking at the role of potential partnerships and individuals who were bringing their own journeys and how it would relate to their friends and their neighbors. We had folks who had very different but deep expertise in economic development, in agriculture, in health. So that led to an incredibly rich opportunity for conversations and for having a different set of viewpoints expressed. It also meant we needed to spend more time understanding the worlds that we all came from and how they related. Finally, we had this transformation for what we called on the ground to on all grounds. And that is to say, I need to give some real credit to Wanjiru Kamu-Rutenberg, who is the founder and executive director of Akili Data. She's one of the Kenyan leaders who guided us. And in an early conversation as we were designing this trip, I said that I wanted to be ready to learn when we landed, that we wanted to be aware of being seen as, quote, Western women with wallets, and instead be in relationship, respecting the leadership, and I talked about it, respecting the leadership on the ground. Wanjiru asked me to think differently. She really pushed to say that it is not just on the ground work there, but that we were on all of our grounds. So that was a shift to really move from just saying it's not about we respect and we just want to learn from you, but there was a real mutuality of bringing in the challenges and the opportunities that were on the ground for each of us and being aware of how that related to the individuals we were visiting with. I'll come back to this when we talk about what has emerged since the trip. So in our design, we looked for enterprises that were four things to address these shifts. The first was that they had to be investable or looking to be. Again, this wasn't about due diligence. We didn't need someone who was currently in a raise, but we also were really trying to find organizations that if they weren't economically viable, investable now, they were headed in that direction, that was their DNA. The second piece was we were looking for diversity in sector, and we saw energy, sanitation, agriculture, health, consumer goods, tech, everything as it related to gender and gender equality. Thirdly, representing different gender lenses, so we were looking for women entrepreneurs. We were also looking for companies that had significant women in their workforce and in their leadership ranks. We were looking for companies that had products and services that were transformative to women. And finally, across the spectrum, we were ideally looking to say we want to understand what's happening in microfinance and we want to understand what's happening in the multinationals. And this became difficult both because we were only there for a week and because of conflicts. So we had a meeting with the head of Coca-Cola's Kenyan operations, and then that fell through. She was out of town. We were looking to meet one of the transformative women's focused microfinance groups, and we again had a schedule conflict. So this was a bit of how do you balance all of these different designs of enterprises that we were trying to get to and make a trip that worked for a set of people in a week. So that gets us to the pace that we kept, and I'll just give a quick flash here, which is to say we had 13 people, 7 days, 2 cities, 10 site visits, 14 organizations that we visited. So some of those site visits had multiple organizations, plus 2 extended receptions where we met people that we couldn't fit into the site visits and where we deliberately looked to introduce them to each other. And I guess, Maryann, I want to stop here and just let you jump in terms of the prep calls, the prep that we did with those organizations, the materials that they provided for us, etc.
Perfect. Getting people ready to go out on a trip like this, we would always like to make sure that we have all information in from every organization. So we ask for the same thing from everybody, which is essentially a summary, some financials, any kind of third-party evaluations, and just the broad strokes of what they wanted to do for the next couple of years and how much it's going to cost. So we hosted an online forum, which actually had a blog, a wiki, and a file repository where we were able to hold all this great information. Jackie and I also hosted probably 2 pre-trip calls to not only give the group a chance to figure out who is bringing what perspectives, but also to talk a little bit, give them a little bit of a frame in which to go out into Kenya and a little bit of background of what we would be covering. So as in many trips, it's always really helpful to get everybody on board a month or 2 before so we can really get everybody ready to go out into another country with all the information that they need.
So hopefully what we've given you is a bit of understanding of what we were trying to accomplish in the trip and the experience that the trip participants had as we headed off to Nairobi. We're going to highlight 4 or 5 different, I guess I would say, lessons learned as the group has debriefed afterwards that have really come to the surface. The first was something that came out in day 1, which is this connection between rights and realities and the blending and overlap of theories of change. For those of you who come from the philanthropic side, you hear this often, what's your theory of change? Impact investors oftentimes also will now talk about their particular theories of change, and sometimes these can clash. On the first day, we spent like 5 hours with 6 amazing women leaders to just really absorb the context of life for women and girls in Kenya, politically, educationally, economically. And one of these women, Anne, brought us the story of the new Kenyan Constitution. Her life and the life of many in her family had been threatened many times over in the course of driving women's rights in this new constitution, and this is a woman who has been given awards by Vital Voices and many other organizations. But she talked to us about the way that it had, she said, look, the ink wasn't even dry on the new constitution before there were amendments proposed to roll back the rights for women. And so she was on a sabbatical, a year-long sabbatical, where she was sharing with women around the country their rights, what had been achieved. And she was being devastated by their realities. She was finding that the cultural norms and laws and practices in many areas were overriding the new laws. And her comment was that the work of groups like ours and the visits and the broader groups that we were going to be talking with was fundamental to support the rights that had been given. In other words, she said, wow, it was not until this sabbatical that I understood that the economic realities that investors and enterprises are making happen for women are actually completely necessary for the rights that I have fought for my entire life to be a reality. But then on the other side, we spent time with entrepreneurs who were working in women's health who saw that, wow, what they were doing was irrelevant without rights to property after a divorce, or without the right to have a say in family health decisions. Without those rights, their business models weren't standing. So this interplay between different theories of change became an underlying conversation for our whole trip. The second learning that we had was probably one of those learnings that you say, oh, right, we knew that, but we didn't really know that, which is the reality of entrepreneurship. In other words, we spent time on the ground with entrepreneurs who had been lauded by many. Many work people said, you absolutely need to see these organizations. They are leading the world in whatever their field was. And then when we were with them day to day, we found that they were honest about the fact that they were still looking for, in this case, the marketing and sales model that would fill the beds of the new maternity ward. So while the story can get ahead, especially in social enterprise circles, the entrepreneurs on the ground, the boots on the ground, are really sorting out how is this going to work in this particular socio-political economic situation. We also found that we had some companies that we visited, in particular a cook stove company that one of our members had invested in, and since that investment, the organizational structure had completely changed. They had been spun off by the U.S. organization that had started. They were recapitalizing on a Kenyan front. They were excited and moving forward, but a whole set of the strategies has changed. So whether you're talking about the bumps in the road that hit when your idea, which was so perfectly created in PowerPoint slides, is actually a year in and you don't have people in your beds, or the capital structures are shifting, we found, again, that entrepreneurship and investing in entrepreneurs, especially in emerging markets, is not for the faint of heart. The third lesson came in this form of the role of philanthropic support. We knew going in that this was critical, and we actually, I think, were probably more optimistic that we would come away with answers, that we would come away and say, now, especially given the talented people on this trip, we have a really simple framework for where and when philanthropic support is appropriate in the gender lens investing ecosystem. And I have to say, it was really challenging. The field is in a big conversation about this, knowing both that philanthropic support is needed to grow a field and hotly debating the times when it distorts incentives and it distorts markets. And we entered into that fray. We talked to entrepreneurs about their need for philanthropic runway. We talked to some who were frustrated because some of their competitors had gotten philanthropic support and they had not. We found many places of debate here and very interesting questions about when was a grant an appropriate role, when should it be a low interest, below interest loan, when is equity appropriate. We didn't come up with an answer, but we sure did tease that debate about, and I think each of us moved our own thinking forward. Finally, we have the lesson about the many different faces of women entrepreneurs, even the so-called non-impact women entrepreneurs. Maryann, you want to jump in here?
Yeah, so here are photographs of just a couple of the entrepreneurs that we had met. I'm going to start on the photograph on the left. This is Andrea Chakava. She's an amazing woman who has had 12 plus years of experience in the finance industry and has recently started her own company in private equity called Alpha Africa Asset Management Advisors. And amazing stories that she was telling was very similar to what many of us who are working in the financial industry find, sort of day to day or even 10 years ago with, the challenges of women in this industry. On the far right is a photo of Eva Mariah. Now, Eva is actually one of the most celebrated women entrepreneurs easily in East Africa, probably in all of Africa. She started her business as a single mother, and Color Creations Limited was her company, and they did a lot of branded merchandise. So she recently launched a much bigger company, which is also working in other countries in Africa, called Branding Strategy and Design. And she's really leveraging her experience in working with large corporations like FedEx, like Xerox, and even groups like Vital Voices. Amazing woman. The woman in the middle is actually a smallholder farm. Now, we went to visit her after a trip to an avocado oil company. So she manages or runs her own farm and supplies avocados to this avocado oil factory. And she was incredible because they really have to make some decisions, even just depending on climate, on how their crop is doing, how a lot of the other smallholder farms are deciding about where to sell and at how much. And one person that we unfortunately don't have a photograph of is a woman who, her name is Pamela, and she had started a restaurant or a chain of restaurants that actually featured Kenyan cuisine. She wanted to bring back the old ways of actually cooking and some of the real authentic ingredients and share it with people in Nairobi. The amazing thing that we heard from her is she talked about her struggles as a woman entrepreneur and trying to find capital to take her 3 restaurants to the next level, perhaps open more. So these are just the range and, like we said, the many faces of the different women entrepreneurs that we met in Kenya.
And one thing I would just underline is Maryann talked about a company which had branded merchandise. One of the members on our trip said, wow, I didn't think about that, right? The company that is basically creating, for all intents and purposes, corporate swag for African companies is having potentially more impact on women and girls than I had realized, because I tend to have an impact lens and think, and this is again, I'm speaking from someone on our trip, think that the company should be reinventing sanitation, which we did visit a company that was doing that, or the company should be dealing with women's maternal health, and we did visit that. But the role that this entrepreneur had played in the Kenyan ecosystem and inspiring women and changing the way women were seen in the workplace was remarkable. So we're having these debates around the different lenses, and if you as an investor were looking to improve gender equality in a region, how you would invest. Which actually gets us to our last lesson, which was the challenges of finding indigenous-based organizations and leadership. So Maryann and I, when we were sourcing who we should visit in Kenya, talked widely to people, and we talked to all the leading impact investors and foundations here in the U.S. We talked to many in Kenya and others. We did find after we went there that we realized we had a bias in our referral network. And so because we came from the U.S., we had a stronger representation of organizations that had investment from U.S.-backed individuals or U.S. organizations. And we found that there was a whole set of groups there that had backing from European organizations. And so that was interesting to watch, where the Norwegian money or the Dutch money and different things like that was happening, and you could start to see where the networks were. But not surprisingly, a lot of the indigenous entrepreneurs lacked that funding basis, and so they were harder to find. And Maryann mentioned Pamela. Here's a woman who, in all extensive purposes, for all extensive purposes, is trying to start the slow food movement in Kenya. And in doing so, if she is successful, could completely transform not only Kenyans' eating patterns and the challenges of obesity that they have there, but also the way of life for a lot of rural women farmers. But she has not had the same kind of both financial and non-financial support that some of the expatriate entrepreneurs have had. And we will say that all of the organizations that we visited, whether they were founded by Kenyans or founded by non-Kenyans, were very clear that the entire next level of leadership was Kenyan. And so they were social entrepreneurs who were looking to work themselves out of a job, and all of them could give us the 3 to 5 year plan where they were working at that. But obviously, we were very aware, especially given that the Westgate tragedy happened immediately after we left Kenya, that oftentimes, if you're not talking about indigenous entrepreneurs, it's much less likely that you're going to have people who stay if things don't go well in a country. We did spend some time at the iHub. This is the Kenyan iHub funded by Omidyar, and we're very encouraged with some of the work there done by women leaders. There's a whole program, both a for-profit and a non-profit program, around supporting women entrepreneurs and teaching women to code. And that process, again, given that Kenya is on the leading edge of all of the work around cell phone focused enterprises and next-gen jumping over a lot of what we have here in the U.S., it was great to see support in that way. But similar to what we have in the U.S., again, very biased in terms of the percentages of male versus female entrepreneurs in that space. Oh, we have one last lesson here, which is the power of the traveling ecosystem. And I've insinuated this already, but we learned from each other a lot. The different viewpoints that came out in questions that we had on the site visits, but also in the way we debriefed. Nairobi traffic is legendary, and it is absolutely as bad as its reputation. So we had lots of time on the minibus to debate, to discuss, and I felt like I spent hours sitting backwards in riveting conversations, trying to piece together not only what we had seen, what we had heard, what we hadn't heard, what wasn't said, what were the dynamics that were going on in the room, how did we contribute or not contribute to those dynamics, and then really importantly, how did this relate to the personal and professional goals that each individual brought with them. And those came out specifically when we start to think about what has happened since the trip. Each individual did come, and we had asked people to identify what their learning goals were and what their organizational goals were. And then afterwards, how they related this trip to them and what they had found. And we've been really excited as to some of the things that were happening and how even in the short amount of time since we've come back from Kenya, there has been real progress. Maryann, do you want to go on to the next slide? Okay. So we can't talk specifically about all of these, but some of the things that have emerged include a social enterprise partnership where there's research and ongoing engagement happening between one of the organizations we visited and one of the organizations that had a representative on the trip. There's a new fund that's not public yet, but around gender and investment that we're very excited about. The trip had an impact on a certification process that one of the organizations was a part of putting together. There's a research agenda specifically that Susan Duffy is leading at Babson. That is very exciting, crossing her work in the Center for Women's Entrepreneurial Leadership with the finance department there. There was a philanthropist who moved her own model of philanthropy and started exploring options for investments as an angel and got engaged with Investor Circle. And there's a set of other pieces that have happened just between the individuals on the trip, so that now when any of us, whether it's we have an opportunity to write a piece, a blog, to go and speak, or we can't, we feel like we have another network, people who are working within this emerging field of gender lens investing, and we know that it does require the investors, the intermediaries, the philanthropists, the researchers, the NGOs, and that we can't achieve the significant ends without collaboration between the private, public, and civil society sectors. So at this point, I wanted to throw it open. I'm hoping that we may have had some individuals who were on the trip able to join us. Is that the case, Maryann?
I think we have Sarah. Sarah, I'm gonna unmute your microphone. Sarah, are you on? I think we have a connection problem. Jackie, do we want to share some stories while we see if Sarah can connect?
Sure, absolutely. So I do wish that you all, and hopefully Sarah will be able to join us, but let me give you a few other pieces from what you're looking at here. So first of all, the upper right here, the no wings or strings attached, is one of the representatives from Ruby Cup, which is a menstrual cup that is taking off in Kenya. And we visited them at the same time that we visited a local sanitary pad maker that's looking at some very interesting models of using indigenous organic material to create biodegradable sanitary pads. And as probably many of you know, the lack of access to sanitary pads creates havoc for girls in Kenya in terms of school interruptions. And what was unusual about the way that we did this visit is we had two organizations that might be seen as competitors working together with us and a whole set of mothers and daughters, and we had a morning where we talked about our experiences. We talked about menstruation and the embarrassment of it, the challenges of it, and got personal in ways that was really life-changing in terms of understanding both what happens and the realities of trading sex for pads and using mattresses and other things, and the ways that these women themselves were defining what they wanted and changing in terms of the roles of for-profit organizations that they were a part of. So again, looking at a challenging question from the eyes of two very different entrepreneurial ventures and bringing them together and thinking about the ways that they were working together with the government to promote access and other things. Another example here, Copia Global on the left, a very new company, in some sense bridging a little bit of Amazon and Mary Kay, or a catalog business. They have created catalogs that show products that range from simple food staples all the way up through televisions, but also include cook stoves, educational products, and other a whole host of things. What they were able to do is go to women entrepreneurs who have mobile stands and give them a catalog. The women become the front for that catalog, and anybody who orders, it's all done through M-Pesa, and the delivery comes within 48 hours. So for many organizations, they were able to increase their income by 50%, many of these women entrepreneurs, while enabling those in their rural neighborhood to have access to goods and services that they would never have had before, because within 2 days something was delivered, as opposed to them having to take 3/4 of a day to go to Nairobi to buy it.
Jackie?
Yes.
I'm sorry. Whenever you're ready, I think we might have Sarah.
Oh, great. Okay. So just, as an example, there are some questions about, is Copia an impact company? Because, well, you can buy, quote unquote, non-impact products through it. So again, great opportunities for conversations about who decides what and what is not impact. I want to let Sarah jump in now.
Oh. Hello?
Sarah?
Yes, hi, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. How can I be helpful to the folks who are on the phone?
We'd love
Hello?
to hear your experiences, Sarah. Any feedback or thoughts, ideas, insights that you can give us from the trip?
Okay, well, delighted to do that. Good afternoon. It's Sarah Cambu with the International Center for Research on Women, and was really delighted and honored to have an opportunity to participate on the Gender Lens investing trip to Kenya. I'm a development practitioner and social scientist by trade, so was actually very excited about the idea of making this trip with people who are coming from the investment sector, a side of life that I am not very familiar with, and to learn basically how to assess these businesses in terms of their readiness for additional funding and investment, what investors might be looking for as they make those judgments, and basically the kinds of returns on investments that investors might be considering when they're looking at women-owned enterprises. On the trip, what I felt was really most useful to me, one, was being able just to carve out the time and to travel with folks who had expertise across all these domains, and to visit with a select group of enterprises that were either women-owned or women-directed, and getting an opportunity just to see what was on the cutting edge in terms of the private sector in Kenya. What I brought, of course, was a development practitioner's perspective. So my background is in sexual reproductive health. I don't know if you've yet seen some of the photos from our visit to the maternity hospital that we visited while in Nairobi, but that was fascinating for me to understand how investors might look at a freestanding hospital, and what I, as a development practitioner, would be looking for in terms of sustainability of the model, connectivity to the population, the target population, which in this case was in slum populations, if you will, in the urban periphery, and potential for growth given that model. So I found that to be a very interesting exchange, and where someone coming from the nonprofit sector who had depth of expertise, in particular sectoral issues of gender and development, could really make a contribution as investors were thinking through what some potential investments might look like. I would say for the International Center for Research on Women, what we drew from this opportunity, first of all, I think lifelong friendships and collaborations certainly in the cards. I mean, you can't be together 10 days straight and doing what we were doing without, I think, really enjoying the people that you're with and sharing, this remarkable experience and not be changed and feel forever that you've got a broader circle of friends. From a business perspective, I was actually able to take forward several of the initial visits that we had through the trip to Kenya and develop them further. And one of them is actually getting lined up for a potential loan through the IFC, which will help this private enterprise expand its support of and purchase of avocados from smallholder farmers in Kenya, potentially move the business model to Tanzania, ICRW to accompany as the research partner, helping this business to really understand its farmer base, what the needs of women smallholder farmers are versus men smallholder farmers, as well as youth. So looking at how to maybe create more nuance in the way that they're approaching the agricultural production through that enterprise. So I was thrilled to hear that Maria and Jackie were looking to head another trip to Brazil this time, and was just thrilled to have this opportunity to tell you it was a remarkable visit, stimulating, honestly stimulating. We all are working 24/7. There's just so much information that can go over the transom, but when you're on the ground and you're having the kinds of in-depth discussions that we were able to have, given the composition of that group, you are really indulging your inner student, if you will, and you apply things differently once you come back and you're moving forward. So if there's anything else that I can add or answer, please just let me know, Jackie and Maria.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sarah. That's I think thank you for the update too, as far as what you're doing with the avocado farmers. We haven't actually gotten an update yet, so that's very exciting.
Yes. Okay.
So I'm going to mute Sarah if we don't have any questions, and we'll do one last part. Which is to talk about the Brazil trip. Jackie, I don't know if you want to tee it up a little bit about our thinking on Brazil, and then I can give people an overview. Jackie?
Sure, absolutely. Thanks. I will just say that as Maryann and I were coming off of the trip, and Sarah and others were incredibly encouraging about the value to them individually, to their organizations, and also to the field, we had the question of, if we were going to do another trip, where would we go? And I had the privilege of being in Brazil earlier last year with the IFC World Bank, looking at small and medium enterprises and specifically the role of gender there, and was very excited about the fact that over 50% of Brazil's entrepreneurs are women, that Itaú, one of the largest banks there, has moved aggressively with the support of IFC to really figure out how it is that it serves the female economy, but that also you have one of the first private equity firms that is focused on gender there in the first fund, run by an amazing woman. And so we were also seeing a reasonably developed impact ecosystem, from a seed stage incubator to a broader SME accelerator, for those of you who know how that process goes, through some of the larger funders. And in some sense, it was that process of saying, wow, Brazil is got a lot of the characteristics of Kenya, but is much more advanced from an impact ecosystem. What would we learn from that trip? How would we start to make additional pieces that could help build this global field that we are so passionate about? And how can we continue to invite philanthropists, researchers, NGOs, impact investors, and others to come together for experiences like what we had in Kenya? So with that, Maryann had the opportunity to do a scouting trip, and she could tell you more about what she found.
Yeah, perfect. Yes, that's one thing that I found has been very important, is to be able to get into the country in advance and do as thorough as possible a scouting trip, just to make everything flow well, but to also get a sense of, opinions from key thought leaders on the ground, as well as to get a chance to visit a variety of organizations. So as you can imagine, the Brazil trip is going to be really different from the Kenya trip, not only because of the country and culture, but because the politics and economy is also very different. As many of you are aware, Brazil has, for some years now, had a booming economy, and so it was a really different experience. We're going to be visiting all for-profit organizations when we go to Brazil in November. Everything from groups that are looking for seed or early stage capital to those that are really, really successful already. When Jackie and I were thinking about how to, which organizations to go to, we actually reached out to a variety of incubators and seed funds to identify some organizations. And the great thing is that when I got on the ground in Brazil, we were able to have even more conversations and get more introductions as well. One thing that I will note here is that there's some really interesting public-private partnerships that we'll be exploring when we get to Brazil. It was so fascinating to see how nonprofit and for-profit organizations are working together to do very special things. I'm going to point out one picture here on the lower right-hand corner. Right here, if you see my arrow, you'll see Asta and Coletivo Coca-Cola. So Coca-Cola was actually looking for a way to use their, instead of recycling, use the bottles that are left over after, the Coke has been consumed. And Asta actually located an amazing women's cooperative that was able to do something really creative, which is to weave these Coke bottles into a very lovely clutch bag, which I have actually, and it's really interesting and innovative ways of starting to think of some of these things. You can see here other examples of groups we'll be visiting, everything from wonderful collectives that are doing, these amazing household goods, over to for-profit companies that are working on the upper left-hand called Sorridentes, who are working on trying to get dental care to lower-income families. And then switching over to the woman in the middle of these amazing women entrepreneurs who are helping to bring, the travel industry into the favelas or the slums. And the woman in the middle actually is a well-known host of what she calls the Favela Inn. And really, they're only blocks from the beach in Copacabana or Ipanema. So these are just examples of some groups that we'll be seeing. It's going to be a 7-day trip, and we'll be going only to Sao Paulo and Rio. And initially we had thought about maybe we should go to other cities. But what we really found out is the most innovative work is being sort of incubated in Sao Paulo and Rio. And that's where we'll be able to really connect to the most forward thinking and see, many, many more organizations. More than any trip, this is probably going to be a place where there's going to be such an amazing exchange of ideas from women in the field, as well as the women that will be coming with us. So I really encourage people to think about coming along with us, or if they know clients or individuals that might be interested, we will be literally releasing registration information for the trip probably early next week. What I'm going to do is, if you have a question on the Brazil trip or anything that we've discussed, if you would either put your hand up, I can unmute you, or simply type in your question for me. While we're waiting, Jackie, is there anything you want to add about the trip that we'll be taking in November?
I think you covered it well. I would say that the other piece I didn't mention is that there is an interesting State Department Aspen partnership that is called Advancing Market Partnerships. That's Brazil focused, that we're connected with. So there's a host of, again, the combination of development banks, traditional banks, the incubators, accelerators, the nonprofits, the women's funds, that are all coming together and weaving this amazing ecosystem that I think it will be great to learn from and with. So, and then to say that we know that this is only one piece of building the Gender Lens ecosystem. We think it is a remarkable privilege to be a part of this, and I will say it was a remarkable privilege to travel with people like Sarah, who, and on the one hand, I would say, well, Sarah doesn't need to go on a trip like this. She knows all of this. And on the other hand, for all of the remarkable leaders that we traveled with, they felt like it was an extreme privilege to be able to carve out a week and really focus, recharge, re-energize. As Susan Duffy said, she said, I feel like I was agitated again in a way that travel does that nothing else really can. Or Jen Price, who said, this was a trip that I needed to take, I just couldn't have taken the time to organize it. So again, it's a real honor to be a part of this process.
Perfect. We are just about at the top of the hour here, and I don't see any questions. So I'll encourage all of you that if you have any questions that come up, please feel free to email either Jackie or I. My email is on the screen now. We really want to thank you for taking time out of your day to join us for this webinar.